When I stepped into the sauna at Clara's family lake house, I didn't expect my pulse to race the way it did. The heat wasn't the culprit, it was the image of him, Richard, Clara's father, seared into my mind. His smile, his piercing gaze, and the magnetic energy between us were impossible to ignore. I leaned back against the wooden paneling, trying to clear my head, but the more I tried to forget, the more vivid the memories became. The lake house was picturesque, nestled in a quiet cove surrounded by dense forest. The air smelled of pine and fresh water, the kind of environment that promised peace. Clara greeted me at the door with her usual exuberance, pulling me into a tight hug. "You're going to love this," she said, her face beaming with excitement. "Dad's gone all out. Wait until you see the renovations." "Your dad's here?" I asked, masking my surprise. I hadn't realized Richard would be joining us. "Yeah, he's staying for the weekend. Don't worry, though. He's super chill," she said with a wave of her hand, as if dismissing any concerns I might have. But I wasn't concerned, just curious. I hadn't seen Richard in years, not since Clara's parents divorced. My memories of him were vague, a distant figure in family gatherings. When I stepped into the living room, there he was. Time had been kind to him. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his tall frame exuded confidence. He greeted me warmly, his deep voice sending an inexplicable flutter through me. "Emily, it's been a long time," he said, extending a hand. "It has," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm but gentle, his touch lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The first evening was uneventful. We laughed over dinner, reminiscing about old times. Richard shared stories about his recent travels, while Clara teased him about his newfound love for yoga. There was nothing out of the ordinary, yet I found myself drawn to him. Every time he spoke, my eyes drifted to him, captivated by his charm and easy demeanor. By the time I went to bed, my thoughts were already betraying me. I told myself it was harmless, a fleeting attraction, nothing more. But deep down, I knew. The next morning, Clara had plans to meet up with some friends in town. "You don't mind hanging out with Dad, do you?" she asked as we finished breakfast. "Not at all," I said, trying to sound casual. My heart, however, betrayed me, pounding at the thought of spending the day alone with Richard. After Claire left, Richard suggested a tour of the property. "I don't think you've seen it since the renovations," he said, gesturing toward the sprawling backyard. We walked along the cobblestone path that led to the dock. The lake sparkled under the mid-morning sun, its surface smooth and inviting. As we reached the edge of the water, Richard paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "It is," I replied, though my focus wasn't on the lake, it was on him, the way his eyes reflected the light, the way his presence seemed to command attention without effort. He turned to me, his expression softening. "Clara talks about you all the time, you know. She says you're the only one who truly gets her." I smiled, touched by the sentiment. "She's like a sister to me. And yet you seem distant," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. I hesitated, caught off guard by his observation. "It's just life. Things aren't always as simple as they used to be." Richard nodded, his eye searching mine. I understand more than you think." The conversation lingered in the air between us, unspoken truths hanging like a thread waiting to be pulled. We walked back to the house in comfortable silence, but the tension was palpable. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," he said, his smile widening. "You just seem different." "Different how? Like you're carrying something heavy? Something you're not sharing?" His words cut through me, exposing the cracks I had tried so hard to hide. I looked away, unsure of how to respond. "You can talk to me, you know," he said, his tone gentle. "Whatever it is, I'm here." For a moment I considered opening up, telling him about the loneliness that had consumed me, about the void in my marriage that seemed impossible to fill. But instead, I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing," I said, but we both knew that wasn't true. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel his eyes on me, his presence overwhelming. I wanted to run, to escape the intensity of the moment, but I also wanted to stay, to see where this unspoken connection would lead. The following day dawned quiet, with the soft hum of the lake providing a soothing backdrop. I woke up feeling restless, my mind replaying fragments of the previous evening in the sauna with Richard. His voice, his presence. It was like they had woven themselves into my thoughts, refusing to let go. I stepped outside onto the deck, hoping the cool morning air would clear my head. Richard was already there, leaning against the railing with a mug of coffee in hand. He glanced over his shoulder as I approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Morning," I replied, hesitating for a moment before joining him. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but as I stood beside him, I became acutely aware of how close we were. The faint scent of his cologne mingled with the crisp air, and my pulse quickened despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me. I nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. "Barely," he admitted, his eyes drifting to the horizon. "Too much on my mind." I didn't press further, but his words hung between us, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable yesterday," he said, his tone measured. In the sauna, the directness of his comment caught me off guard, and for a moment I wasn't sure how to respond. "No, of course not," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Good. I'd hate to think I crossed a line. Later that morning, Clara suggested a hike through the woods surrounding the property. "Come on, Emily," she urged, grabbing her water bottle. "It's gorgeous out there." I hesitated, glancing at Richard, who stood nearby with an unreadable expression. "I'll catch up," I said. "I need a moment to myself." Clara shrugged. "Suit yourself, don't take too long." Once she disappeared into the trees, Richard approached me. "Not in the mood for hiking?" "Not today," I said, trying to sound casual. In truth, I wasn't ready to face Clara, not with the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Richard hesitated, then gestured toward the lake. "Walk with me?" I nodded, my heart racing as we headed toward the water. The path was narrow, forcing us to walk close together. Our arms brushed occasionally, each touch sending a jolt through me. "You seem lost in thought," he said after a while. I glanced at him, unsure how much to reveal. "Just reflecting on things. Anything I can help with?" I hesitated, debating whether to open up. There was something about Richard, his steady presence, his genuine concern, that made me feel safe. "It's my marriage," I admitted finally. "Things haven't been easy." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Marriage can be complicated. Trust me, I know." We reached the edge of the lake and sat down on a weathered bench. The water lapped gently at the shore, a soothing rhythm that seemed to encourage honesty. "I feel invisible," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper, like I'm just there, existing, but not really seen. Richard didn't respond immediately, but his gaze was steady, his silence inviting me to continue. "I love Daniel," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But sometimes I wonder if love is enough, if it can survive the weight of everything else." Richard reached out, placing a hand on mine. His touch was warm, grounding. "You deserve to be seen, Emily," he said softly. "You deserve to feel alive." The intensity of his words struck a chord deep within me. I looked at him, searching his face for answers, for reassurance. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place: compassion, understanding, and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. That evening, Clara suggested another sauna session. "It's good for the skin," she said with a grin, "and after that hike, I could use the detox." I couldn't bring myself to join her. The thought of being in the sauna again with Richard's memory lingering in the air was too much. "You go ahead," I said, feigning a yawn. "I think I'll turn in early." Clara gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press further. "Your loss," she said, disappearing down the hall. I wandered outside instead, hoping the cool night air would calm my restless mind. The stars were brilliant against the inky sky, their light reflecting off the still lake. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly feeling small and exposed. Couldn't sleep. Richard's voice startled me, and I turned to see him stepping out of the shadows, his hands tucked into his pocket. "Just needed some air," I said, my voice shaky. He nodded, moving to stand beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the gentle rustling of the trees. "There's something about this place," he said finally. "It makes you confront things you've been avoiding." I glanced at him, my chest tightening. "Is that what you're doing?" "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I'm just here because I needed a change." The weight of his words lingered, their meaning unclear yet profound. He turned to me, his expression serious. I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. But instead of speaking, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was soft, tentative, and it sent a wave of warmth through me. "You're incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't think you even realize it." My heart pounded as his words sank in. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the intensity of the moment left me speechless. Richard stepped closer, his hand lingering on my cheek. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the magnetic pull that had been growing stronger with each passing day. I knew I should step back, put some distance between us, but I couldn't move. And then he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative and full of hesitation, but as the seconds passed, it deepened, the weight of our unspoken desires finally breaking free. His hands rested on my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. When we finally pulled apart, reality came crashing back. I stepped back, my breathing ragged. I can't," I stammered, shaking my head. Richard's expression was a mix of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't have—" "No," I interrupted. I need to go." I turned and hurried back to the house, my mind racing. My emotions were a whirlwind: guilt, desire, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a weekend getaway anymore. It was a storm I hadn't seen coming, and I wasn't sure I could weather. The morning after the kiss with Richard, I woke to the sound of soft waves brushing against the shore. For a moment, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping the events of the previous night were nothing more than a dream. But as the warmth of his lips on mine returned to my memory, I knew it was real. I sat up and pressed my palms to my temples, trying to still the storm brewing inside me. What had I done? How had I let it go this far? I thought of Clara, her carefree laugh and her unwavering trust in me, and Daniel, my husband, the man I had promised to love and honor. Shame curled in my stomach like a heavy stone. I needed clarity and fast. The day began as if nothing had happened. Clara was bustling about the kitchen, her energy as bright and bubbly as ever. She smiled when she saw me. Finally up, Dad made pancakes, she said, gesturing toward the counter. Richard stood by the stove, flipping another pancake onto a plate. His movements were calm, controlled, and infuriatingly unbothered, as if last night had been an ordinary evening. He turned and met my eyes, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, almost too casual. "Morning," I replied, forcing a weak smile. My voice sounded strained, even to me. Clara handed me a mug of coffee, oblivious to the tension between us. "We're thinking of taking the boat out today. You in?" I hesitated, but the thought of being trapped on a boat with Richard made my stomach churn. "Maybe later. I was thinking of going for a walk first." "Suit yourself," Clara said with a shrug, already moving on to another topic. After breakfast, I slipped out of the house and onto the forest path that led around the lake. The air was crisp, the morning sun filtering through the trees. I walked quickly, as if I could outrun the weight of my thoughts, but no matter how far I went, the kiss followed me, a haunting echo I couldn't escape. Half an hour later, I reached a secluded clearing where the lake stretched out before me, the water calm and inviting. I sat on a flat rock by the shore, hugging my knees to my chest, and let the silence envelop me. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend it never happened? Confront him? Tell Clara? The idea of confessing made my chest tighten. I could already picture the hurt in her eyes, the disbelief in her voice. "And if I join you?" I jumped at the sound of Richard's voice and turned to see him standing a few feet away. He had a knack for appearing when I least expected it. "Needed some air," I said, my voice defensive as I looked away. "So did I," he replied, sitting down on the rock beside me. "Clara's prepping the boat. She's excited about today." I nodded, avoiding his gaze. The silence between us was thick, the weight of unspoken words pressing down like a vice. "I'm sorry about last night," he said finally, his voice low. "I shouldn't have kissed you." My heart twisted at the remorse in his tone, but his apology only made things more complicated. If he regretted it, why had it felt so real? So consuming. "I shouldn't have let you," I admitted, my words barely audible. "But it happened, and now we don't know what to do," he finished for me. His gaze was intense, piercing through my defenses. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "This is all wrong, Richard. You're Clara's father. I'm married. We can't—" "I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I know we shouldn't, but that doesn't change the way I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing the risk of saying more. "I mean, I see you, Emily. I see the woman you are, not just the role you're playing. And I think you've been hiding for a long time." My breath caught in my throat. His words struck a nerve, exposing truths I had been too afraid to face. "You don't know me," I whispered, though the protest felt weak. "Don't I?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel the same." I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. By the time we returned to the house, the tension between us had only grown. Clara was already on the dock, waving excitedly as she boarded the boat. "Come on, you two, let's go." I hesitated, but there was no avoiding it. Richard followed me onto the boat, and soon we were gliding across the water, the engine humming beneath us. Clara chattered away, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the day wore on, the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the lake. We anchored near a small island, and Clara jumped into the water with a splash, laughing as she swam toward the shore. "You two coming?" she called over her shoulder. "You go ahead," Richard said, waving her off. "We'll catch up." As Clara swam away, I turned to him, my heart pounding. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not fair to her." I know, he said, his expression conflicted. But what do you want me to do, Emily? Pretend I don't care? Pretend I don't feel something every time I'm near you? Tears stung my eyes as I looked away. This isn't just about us. There are people we care about. People who will get hurt. I care about you, he said, his voice steady, and I know you feel it too. I shook my head, trying to silence the voice inside me that wanted to believe him. This can't happen, Richard. It's too messy, too complicated. Life is messy, Emily, he said, his tone firm. But sometimes the mess is worth it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to avoid him, to focus on Clara and the simple joy of being on the lake, but no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to him, to his words, his presence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the deck, staring out at the water. Clara had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's adventures. I thought I was alone until I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't mean to disturb you, Richard said, stepping onto the deck. You didn't, I replied, though my voice betrayed the turmoil inside me. He sat down beside me, and for a long time we didn't speak. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the dock. I don't know what to do, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm being torn in two. He reached out, his hand covering mine. Then let me help you carry it, he said softly. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The night after the boat trip, the house felt eerily quiet. Clara had gone to bed early again, worn out from the day's activities, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And with him, Richard. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness. I sat in the living room, a book open in my lap, though I wasn't reading a word. My thoughts were too loud, drowning out the world around me. When Richard entered the room, I felt it before I saw him. His presence was magnetic, an unspoken energy that pulled at me even as I tried to resist. He hesitated in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. Couldn't sleep? He asked softly. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. No, he nodded, stepping into the room. Neither could I. He moved to the couch across from me, settling in with a sigh. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us laden with the weight of all we couldn't say. Finally, he broke the tension. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady, about everything. I closed my book, my fingers trembling slightly. And I don't know how to stop feeling this way, he admitted, his eyes meeting mine. No matter how wrong it is, no matter how much I tell myself to let it go, I can't. My breath caught, his words stirring something deep within me. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was alone in his feelings, but I couldn't. The truth was written all over my face, in the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near, in the way my thoughts always drifted back to him. Richard, I began, my voice shaking, this can't happen. It's not fair to Clara, or to my husband. I know, he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. But I can't pretend there's nothing here. The raw honesty in his voice was like a knife to my chest. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, a mix of fear and longing. Let's just take it one moment at a time, he said. No decisions, no plans, just this. His words were dangerous, seductive in their simplicity. They promised nothing and everything all at once, and in that moment, I hated how much I wanted to believe him. The next day, I tried to keep my distance, I busied myself with Clara, helping her prepare lunch and listening to her chatter about her plans for the weekend. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to him, to Richard. By mid-afternoon, Clara announced she was heading into town to pick up some supplies. "You guys want to come?" she asked, glancing between us. "I think I'll stay here," I said quickly, my voice a little too eager. "Same," Richard added, his tone casual. Clara gave us a curious look but didn't press further. "Suit yourselves," she said, grabbing her keys. "I'll be back in a couple of hours." The moment the door closed behind her, the tension in the house became palpable. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean up, while Richard lingered in the living room. I could feel his eyes on me, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Finally, he appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room. "Emily," he said softly. I turned to face him, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, taking a step closer. "But I can't seem to stop." His honesty was disarming, and I felt my resolve slipping. "This is wrong, Richard," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "We're hurting people." "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, his tone earnest. "But I can't ignore this. Connection. Can you?" The question hung between us, daring me to answer, and for the first time I let myself admit the truth. "No," I whispered. "I can't." The distance between us disappeared in an instant. He closed the gap, his hand cupping my cheek as he looked into my eyes. "Then let me make you feel alive," he said, his voice a low murmur. And then he kissed me. This time there was no hesitation. His lips were firm and insistent, his touch igniting something within me that had been dormant for far too long. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, as if I could anchor myself to him and forget everything else. When we finally broke apart, our breathing was ragged, the reality of what we had done crashing down around us. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. This has to stop," I said, though my body betrayed me, still yearning for his touch. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But tell me you don't feel something. Tell me this doesn't mean anything to you." I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, because they would have been a lie. Instead, I turned and fled, leaving him standing there in the kitchen, the weight of our actions pressing down on both of us. I spent the rest of the afternoon by the lake, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions that had taken hold of me. Guilt, desire, fear, they all swirled together, leaving me feeling raw and exposed. When Clara returned, she was her usual cheerful self, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I forced myself to smile, to laugh at her jokes, to pretend everything was normal. But inside, I was unraveling. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, Richard found me sitting on the dock. He approached cautiously, as if afraid to scare me away. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, "we need to talk." I looked up at him, my chest tightening. "There's nothing to talk about." "There's everything to talk about," he countered, sitting down beside me. "I know this is complicated, messy, but I also know that I can't just walk away from this, from you." His words were a dangerous mix of honesty and temptation, and I hated how much they resonated with me. "What do you expect me to do, Richard?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Leave my husband? Destroy my friendship with Clara?" "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. I need you to know how I feel, because pretending I don't care isn't working." I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. "And what about me?" I whispered. "What happens when this all falls apart, when everyone gets hurt?" He reached out, taking my hand in his. "Then we'll face it together," he said, his voice steady. "But for now, all I can do is be here. For you." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of the lake house, casting long shadows on the hardwood floors. Clara had made plans to go kayaking, her enthusiasm as unrelenting as ever. "Come on, Emily. It's the perfect way to clear your head," she urged as she loaded gear onto the dock. I hesitated, my excuses drying on my tongue. Before I could respond, Richard appeared, his calm voice cutting through the moment. "I'll stay behind with Emily," he said casually. "You go on ahead, Clara. It'll be good for you to have some time to yourself." Clara didn't question his offer. She gave us a quick wave and headed toward the kayak, disappearing into the water moments later. As the ripples faded in her wake, silence enveloped the house. Richard leaned against the counter in the kitchen, watching me as I pretended to busy myself with the coffee maker. The weight of his gaze was impossible to ignore. Finally, he broke the silence. "We can't keep doing this dance," he said, his voice low but steady. I froze, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," he said, taking a step closer. "This, whatever it is between us, we're either going to face it or run from it, but we can't keep pretending it doesn't exist." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "And what do you propose, Richard? That we just throw caution to the wind, risk everything?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know that I haven't felt this alive in years, and I think you haven't either." His words hit a nerve, the raw honesty cutting through my carefully constructed defenses. "It doesn't matter how we feel," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. There are people who will get hurt." "People always get hurt, Emily," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But how long are you going to keep sacrificing yourself? How long are you going to keep living for everyone else instead of for yourself?" Tears stung my eyes as his words settled over me. He was right, and that truth was almost unbearable. I had spent years prioritizing everyone else, Daniel, Clara, the image of a perfect marriage, while neglecting the part of me that craved something more. Later that afternoon, Richard suggested we take a walk down to the dock. I hesitated, but something in his expression made me agree. The path was quiet, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. When we reached the dock, he stopped and turned to me. "Do you ever think about what you want?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I looked out at the water, the sunlight dancing on its surface. "I don't know anymore," I admitted. "It feels selfish to even think about it." "It's not selfish to want to be happy," he said, stepping closer. "It's human." I turned to face him, the distance between us shrinking with each passing second. His gaze was intense, filled with a mix of longing and determination. "What do you want, Richard?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You," he said simply. "I want you, Emily." The weight of his words stole my breath, leaving me vulnerable and exposed. I wanted to run to escape the intensity of the moment, but I also wanted to stay, to let myself feel everything I had been suppressing. "I'm scared," I admitted, the tears I had been holding back finally spilling over. "So am I," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm more scared of letting this slip away." His hands found mine, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Slowly, hesitantly, I let myself lean into him. His arms wrapped around me, holding me tightly, as if he could shield me from the storm brewing inside. The hours passed in a blur. Clara returned from kayaking, oblivious to the tension that had settled between Richard and me. We spent the evening together, sharing stories and laughter, but the unspoken connection between Richard and me was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch, every stolen moment felt like a secret only we shared. After dinner, Clara announced she was heading into town to meet some friends for drinks. "You two okay holding down the fort?" she asked with a grin. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. The moment she left, the house felt unbearably quiet. I wandered onto the back deck, hoping the cool night air would calm my restless mind. But when Richard joined me, the tension only grew. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Richard, this is dangerous. We're playing with fire." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But I'm willing to get burned if it means being with you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, a mix of fear and exhilaration. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's not fair to Clara, or to Daniel." "Is your marriage really worth saving?" he asked gently. "Or are you holding on because it feels like the right thing to do?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so long convincing myself that staying with Daniel was the noble choice, the responsible choice. But was it the right choice? Or had I been hiding behind it, afraid to face the truth? "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. Richard reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "Then let me show you what it feels like to be truly seen," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. And then he kissed me. This kiss was different from the others, deeper, more urgent, as if we were both trying to capture something fleeting. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself surrender to the moment. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my breathing ragged. "This is madness," I said, shaking my head. "We can't keep doing this." "Then tell me to stop," he said, his gaze locked on mine. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come, because I couldn't tell him to stop, not when every fiber of my being was screaming for more. The truth was undeniable now. I wanted him. I wanted this. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. We sat together on the deck, talking about everything and nothing, the connection between us deepening with every word. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. But as the night wore on, the weight of reality began to settle over me. This wasn't sustainable. This wasn't safe, and sooner or later it would all come crashing down. But for now, I let myself live in the moment, knowing that the consequences would have to wait. The morning after that charged moment in the living room, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I lingered in bed, the sheets twisted around my legs, my heart heavy with guilt and longing. I knew I was walking a razor-thin line, teetering between my desire for Richard and the life I was supposed to be living. Every glance, every word, every touch from him felt like both a gift and a curse. Claire's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Emily, get up, sleepyhead. We're going for a hike today." I groaned softly, pushing myself upright. A hike meant more time with Clara and with Richard, more time to pretend everything was normal, to act like the growing connection between Richard and me didn't exist. The trail Clara chose was tucked deep within the woods surrounding the lake house. It was shaded by towering trees, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. Clara walked ahead, her excitement infectious, while Richard and I followed a few paces behind. "You okay?" Richard asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. I glanced at him, my throat tightening. "I'm fine," I lied. He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. Still, we walked in silence, the tension between us growing with every step. Halfway through the hike, Clara found a clearing with a small stream trickling through it. "Let's take a break here," she said, dropping her backpack onto a patch of grass. Richard and I settled onto a fallen log nearby, the space between us feeling both too close and too far. Clara rummaged through her bag, pulling out a water bottle and some snacks, her chatter filling the air. But I barely heard her. My attention was focused on Richard, on the way his hands rested on his knees, his fingers twitching slightly as if he were holding himself back. My own hands were clenched in my lap, the urge to reach for him almost unbearable. When Clara wandered off to explore the stream, Richard turned to me. "Emily, we need to talk." I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "Not here, not now." Then?" he asked, his frustration evident. "We can't keep avoiding this." "I don't know," I admitted, my eyes welling with tears. "I don't know how to fix this." He reached for my hand, his touch both comforting and electric. "I don't want to fix it," he said softly. "I don't want to lose you." His words shattered the fragile wall I had built around my heart. I looked at him, my chest aching with a mix of love and guilt. "This is wrong, Richard," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but that doesn't change how I feel." Before I could respond, Clara called out to us, "Come on, you two, you've got to see this." We pulled apart quickly, the moment broken. But the weight of his words lingered, the unspoken truth hanging in the air between us. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Clara was oblivious, her cheerful demeanor a sharp contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. After dinner, she suggested we play a card game, her laughter filling the room as she dealt the cards. Richard and I played along, but our focus was elsewhere. Every time his hand brushed against mine, a jolt of electricity shot through me. Every time our eyes met, the tension between us grew. When Clara finally went to bed, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I lingered in the living room, staring out the window at the moonlit lake. The house was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees outside. I turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to Clara or to Daniel." "I know," he said, his tone soft but resolute. "But what we have, it's real, and I can't let it go." Tears stung my eyes as I looked at him. "I don't know how to do this, Richard. I don't know how to make it stop." He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. "Maybe we don't have to," he said softly. "Maybe we just need to take it one moment at a time." His touch was intoxicating, his words a dangerous temptation. I wanted to resist, to push him away, but instead I leaned into him, my defenses crumbling. When our lips met, it was as if the world fell away. The kiss was deep and desperate, filled with all the emotions we had been holding back. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself surrender to the moment. But as quickly as it began, the weight of reality came crashing down. I pulled back, my breathing ragged, my heart racing. "This isn't right," I said, shaking my head. "We can't keep doing this." "Then tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice breaking. "Tell me you don't feel the same and I'll walk away." I looked at him, my chest aching with the weight of everything unsaid. "I can't," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes softened and he reached for my hand. "Then let's stop fighting it," he said. "Let's just be." The rest of the night passed in a haze. We sat together on the couch, our hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly understood. But as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the weight of what we had done began to settle over me. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a choice. one that would have consequences far beyond anything I could imagine. And yet, as I looked at Richard, his gaze filled with a mix of longing and regret, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The morning after, the guilt was almost unbearable. I had hardly slept, my mind consumed by the events of the previous night. The stolen kiss, the whispered promises. It felt like a dream, and yet the weight of it lingered, heavy and unrelenting. I knew I needed space to think, to breathe. But in this house, where every glance from Richard sent my heart spiraling. Clara was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, humming softly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She looked up and smiled, her cheerfulness an innocent contrast to the turmoil churning inside me. "Morning, Em, you're up early," she said brightly. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Couldn't sleep." "Same here." Richard's voice cut through the room. I turned sharply to see him standing in the doorway, his gaze locking with mine for a split second before he shifted his attention to Clara. "Thought I'd take a walk by the lake," he continued casually, as if the tension between us didn't exist. Clara perked up. "Sounds nice. Emily, why don't you join him? I'll catch up after breakfast." Her suggestion caught me off guard, and I fumbled for an excuse. I should help you clean up." "Nonsense," Clara interrupted with a grin. "I can handle it. Go enjoy the morning." Richard's eyes met mine, his expression unreadable. "Shall we?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. I hesitated but eventually nodded, knowing that refusing would only arouse suspicion. "Sure." The path to the lake was quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant rustling of leaves. I walked a few steps ahead of Richard, keeping a deliberate distance. The air between us was charged, and I knew it was only a matter of time before one of us broke the silence. "Emily," he said finally, his voice low. I stopped, turning to face him. "We can't keep doing this, Richard," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. Whatever this is, it has to stop." He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You've said that before," he replied softly. "But do you really want it to stop?" His question hung in the air, daring me to answer. My throat tightened and I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "It doesn't matter what I want," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. There are other people. Clara, Daniel. And what about you?" He interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "When was the last time you let yourself want something for you, Emily? When was the last time you stopped living for everyone else and started living for yourself?" Tears stung my eyes, his words cutting through me like a blade. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "Maybe it is," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe the only thing holding you back is fear." I shook my head, the tears spilling over now. "I can't," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't do this, Richard." He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, wiping away a tear. "Then tell me to leave," he said quietly. "Tell me to walk away and I will. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then please, Emily, don't push me away." I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of his words. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but grounding. "Let me be the one thing you don't have to figure out," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Just for now, just for this moment." And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the boundaries of what we could allow ourselves. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, the restraint between us unraveling. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself surrender to the moment. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we had done hit me like a wave. I stepped back, my breathing ragged, my mind racing. "This is madness," I said, shaking my head. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, his voice steady. But I also know that walking away from you feels impossible. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Clara was her usual cheerful self, blissfully unaware of the storm raging just beneath the surface. Richard and I exchanged only the briefest of glances, careful not to draw attention to the growing connection between us. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara suggested we take the boat out for one last ride. "It's our last night here," she said, her excitement contagious. "We have to make the most of it." I hesitated but eventually agreed, knowing that refusing would only raise questions. Richard joined us without hesitation, his demeanor calm and collected. We set out onto the lake, the water smooth and reflective like glass. Clara sat at the bow, her laughter ringing out as she leaned over to trail her fingers in the water. I stayed near the stern, the cool breeze doing little to calm the fire burning inside me. Richard joined me, his presence a mix of comfort and torment. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though the tightness in my chest said otherwise. "I'm fine." He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "I don't know how to carry it at all." Before he could respond, Clara called out to us. "You guys are so quiet back there. Come join me." And Richard hesitated but eventually nodded. "Coming," he called, giving me one last look before moving to join her. As the boat glided back to the dock, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The weekend was ending, and soon we would have to return to the real world, to the lives we had built before this. The thought filled me with a mix of dread and relief. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between the life I had and the life I wanted. Something had to give. But as I stared at the ceiling, the memory of Richard's touch, his kiss, his words, all of it felt impossible to let go. And for the first time, I wondered if I even wanted to. The final morning at the lake house was cloaked in an unbearable silence. The chirping of birds and the gentle lapping of the lake against the dock felt cruelly at odds with the storm brewing inside me. Clara's cheerful energy filled the kitchen as she prepared breakfast, completely oblivious to the tension between her father and me. Every glance from Richard felt like a knife, cutting through the delicate balance I was desperately trying to maintain. "Coffee?" Clara asked, holding up the pot. "Yes, please," I replied, forcing a smile. My voice sounded hollow, even to myself. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression calm, though his fingers drummed lightly on the surface, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed before. He caught my eye briefly, but neither of us spoke. There was too much at stake, too many unspoken words that couldn't be voiced. "Emily," Clara said, breaking the silence, "I was thinking we should all take a picture before we leave. You know, to remember the weekend?" I nodded mechanically. "Sure, that sounds nice." She beamed and set her coffee cup down. "Great, I'll grab my phone after breakfast." Richard's eyes flickered to me, and I could see the tension there. A photograph, a frozen moment in time where we'd have to pretend everything was normal, that nothing had happened. After breakfast, Clara dragged us to the dock for her impromptu photo session. The water sparkled in the sunlight, the perfect backdrop for what should have been a happy memory. Clara posed us in various configurations, her laughter echoing across the lake. But every time Richard stood beside me, every time his hand brushed mine or our shoulders touched, it felt like a betrayal of Clara, of Daniel, of everything we had both once valued. "Smile, you two," Clara teased as she snapped a photo of Richard and me. "You look so serious." I forced a grin, the effort almost painful. Richard's expression mirrored mine, a mix of forced lightness and buried emotion. The drive back to reality was quiet. Clara had volunteered to take the first shift driving, chattering happily about her plans for the week. I sat in the back seat staring out the window, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a physical force. Richard sat in the passenger seat, his shoulders tense as he nodded along to Clara's anecdotes. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. The stolen moments, the whispered confessions, the kiss that had changed everything. And now, as we returned to the lives we had left behind, the full weight of the consequences loomed large. When we finally pulled into Clara's driveway, she turned to me with a wide grin. "This weekend was amazing. We have to do it again soon." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Yeah, definitely." Richard didn't look at me as I climbed out of the car, but as I walked toward my own, I felt his presence behind me, his unspoken words lingering in the air. The weight of my secrets was unbearable, pressing down on me until every moment felt like a precarious balancing act. That night, as I lay awake next to Daniel, my mind refused to quiet. His steady breathing, the familiar rhythm of our life together, should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like a reminder of all the ways I had betrayed him. I needed to make a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly torn between guilt and longing. But the thought of confessing to Daniel, to Clara, filled me with dread. How could I look either of them in the eye and admit what I'd done? The following afternoon, Clara texted me. "Dad's stopping by later. Join us for dinner?" I stared at the message, my heart racing. Richard, here? The thought sent a jolt through me, both of excitement and terror. I knew I should say no, that seeing him again would only make things worse. But instead, I found myself typing back. "Sure. What time?" When I arrived at Clara's house that evening, she greeted me with her usual warmth. "Dad's just running late," she said, ushering me inside. "He should be here any minute." I nodded, my throat tight. The minutes stretched on as we sat in the living room, chatting about her latest project at work. But I could barely focus, my nerves fraying with every passing second. When the doorbell finally rang, my chest tightened. Clara jumped up to answer it, her cheerful voice filling the hallway. "Dad, come in, you're just in time." "We need to talk," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Not here," I whispered, glancing toward the hallway where Clara had disappeared. "Not now." "Artane," he pressed, his voice low but insistent. "Emily, we can't keep pretending this didn't happen." Before I could respond, Clara returned, her cheerful energy breaking the moment. But the tension lingered, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. After dinner, Clara insisted on dessert, disappearing into the kitchen to fetch a tray of brownies. Richard and I were left alone in the living room, the quiet between us almost unbearable. "Emily," he said, his voice firm. "This can't go on like this." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "I know," I said quietly. "But what do you expect me to do, Richard? Tell Clara? Tell Daniel? It would destroy them." "And lying to them isn't?" he asked, his tone sharp. "We're already destroying them, Emily, just in slower motion." His words hit me like a slap, the truth of them cutting deep. But before I could respond, Clara reappeared, balancing the tray of brownies in one hand and a stack of plates in the other. "Hope you saved room for dessert," she said, her smile bright. The weight of my secrets had reached a breaking point. The lies I had built were fragile, and I could feel the cracks widening with each passing day. That morning, as I poured coffee and stared blankly at the counter, Daniel's voice startled me. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. I turned, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the mug. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "Work's been hectic." He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You sure that's all?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Yeah, I'm fine. But I wasn't fine, and I knew it. The tension inside me was building, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Later that afternoon, Clara called. Her voice was uncharacteristically subdued, and it sent a chill through me. "Emily," she began, hesitating, "can you come over? I need to talk to you." My stomach twisted. "Of course," I said quickly. "Is everything okay?" "Just come," she said softly before hanging up. When I arrived at Clara's house, she was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The sight of her sent a wave of dread crashing over me. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer right away, her eyes searching mine. Finally, she said, "Dad's inside. We need to have a conversation." I froze, my heart pounding. "Clara, I—" "Don't," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Just come in." I followed her inside, my legs feeling like lead. Richard was sitting in the living room, his expression grim. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze was unbearable. Clara sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. The silence in the room was deafening, and my pulse raced as I waited for someone to speak. "I know something's been going on," Clara said finally, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "I've noticed how you two look at each other, how you act when you think I'm not paying attention." My breath caught in my throat. "Clara, it's not—" "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "I deserve the truth." Richard spoke then, his voice calm but filled with regret. "Clara, I never meant to hurt you. Neither of us did." Her gaze shifted to him, her expression crumbling. "So it's true," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. You betrayed me." I felt my own tears spilling over as I reached for her. "Clara, please. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." She pulled back, her voice rising. "Then why? Why would you do this, Emily? You're supposed to be my best friend. How could you—" "With my dad?" The raw pain in her voice shattered me. "I don't have an excuse," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how it happened. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done." Richard tried to interject, but she turned on him, her anger boiling over. "And you're my father. How could you do this to me? To her?" He flinched, his composure slipping. "Clara, I—" "Don't," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "I don't want to hear it." She stood abruptly, her face streaked with tears. "I need you both to leave. Now." The drive home was silent, the air between Richard and me heavy with everything that had just unfolded. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my vision blurred by tears. I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't want it to happen like this." I shook my head, my throat tight. "It doesn't matter. It happened, and now everything is ruined." When we reached my house, he hesitated, his hand on the door handle. "Don't end up," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "Just go, Richard, please." He nodded silently and stepped out of the car. As I watched him walk away, a hollow ache settled in my chest. I had lost everything. My best friend, my stability, and the fragile connection I had built with Richard. And now I was left to pick up. That night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, the weight of my actions pressed down on me like a crushing force. Clara's words replayed in my mind, her betrayal and heartbreak echoing in every corner of my being. I didn't know how to move forward, how to face the wreckage I had caused. All I knew was that I couldn't undo what had been done, and that realization was more devastating than anything I had ever faced. The silence in my house was deafening. broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the creak of a floorboard beneath my pacing feet. The fallout from Clara's discovery was all-consuming, and I couldn't shake the image of her tear-streaked face, the pain in her voice, and the shattered trust in her eyes. Daniel, oblivious to the storm brewing around me, was seated at the kitchen table, scrolling through his laptop. He glanced up as I walked by for the third time, his brow furrowed. "You're restless," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Something on your mind?" I froze, my heart pounding. The question was so innocuous, but it cut through me like a blade. "Just work," I lied, my voice trembling. "I've got a lot going on." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Let me know if you need to talk." I mumbled something in return, retreating to the bedroom where I could collapse into the suffocating solitude of my guilt. 2 days passed in a blur. Clara didn't call, and I didn't have the courage to reach out. Every time I picked up my phone, my hand would tremble, and I'd put it down again. What could I say? How could I even begin to repair the damage I'd done? When the phone finally rang, it was Richard. His name on the screen made my stomach twist in knots, but I answered. "Emily," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Have you heard from Clara?" "No," I admitted, my throat tightening. "I think she's done with me. With us." He sighed, the sound filled with a weariness that mirrored my own. "I tried to talk to her, but she won't hear me out. She said she needs space." "Maybe she's right," I said, though the words felt like a knife to my chest. "Maybe space is what we all need." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Do you regret it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I closed my eyes, the weight of my emotions threatening to crush me. "I don't know," I whispered. "I regret hurting her. I regret the lies. But you, what we had?" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Richard didn't push me. Instead, he simply said, "I'm sorry for everything, Emily. I never wanted it to end like this." "Neither did I said, tears streaming down my face. "But maybe it was never meant to last." The following weekend, I finally gathered the courage to call Clara. The phone rang endlessly, each tone tightening the knot in my stomach. When her voicemail picked up, I hesitated, then left a message. "Clara, it's me. I don't even know where to begin, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I never meant to hurt you. Please, if you're willing to talk, I'm here." The days that followed were agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap, only to sink when it wasn't Clara. The silence was its own form of punishment, a reminder of the irreparable damage I had caused. One evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He found me sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. "You've been off lately," he said, sitting down beside me. "I'm worried about you." I forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, just tired." "Emily," he said, his tone gentle but insistent, "if something's wrong, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll get through it." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the secrets I'd been carrying, but the thought of seeing the betrayal in his eyes, of losing the life we had built, was too much to bear.